Professor Justin Brooke. We met at the Festival della Giustizia Penale in Modena, professor of law in California, and also a criminal defense attorney for many years. And since 1999, you founded and you are the director too of the California Innocence Project. Could you tell us how this project started and what happened in your career to make you somehow make this big change in your life?
Sure. So 25 years ago, I was teaching law school in Michigan, and I read in the newspaper about a young woman sitting on death row in Chicago. And the article said that she'd been sentenced to death on a plea bargain. And I thought, how can anyone be sentenced to death on a plea bargain? A plea bargain is a negotiation between the prosecution and the defense to come up with a sentence that they agree on, and then the defense gives up having a trial. So a plea bargain means you never went to trial. So I'm thinking, how can this person get the death penalty after negotiating a plea? Because what did she get in exchange for that? There's nothing worse the government could do to her. So I went and met with her on death row, and she told me that her lawyer told her that's what she should do. She should just say she's guilty. And then she told me that she was innocent. So I went back to my law school where I was teaching, and I told my students that story. I said, there's this woman, she's 21 years old, sitting on death row, waiting to be executed, and she said she's innocent. Who wants to help me out on this case? And 4 students raised their hands, and that for me was the birth of my innocence work. We sat around my kitchen table and looked through all the documents. We went to the crime scene, we tracked down witnesses, and we put back together the story, and were able to show that there was strong evidence of her innocence. And we were able to get her death sentence reversed.
Okay.
Sadly, the court would never let me withdraw her guilty plea. So when I got it back to court, she could only get a life sentence, and the jury only had a choice between life or death. So she is actually still in prison. This 25 years later, I'm still working to get her out of prison. But I was inspired from working on that case that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I quit my job and I moved to California, and I started the California Innocence Project because that's the biggest state in the United States. It has the biggest prison system. California's prison system is bigger than most countries in the world. We have more than 150,000 people in prison just in California. We have 600 people on death row.
Wow.
We have some of the toughest sentences in the world. For instance, after 3 felonies in California, you're sentenced to prison for the rest of your life. Yeah, and it doesn't have to be very serious. It can be drug crimes. And so I started the California Innocence Project in 1999. That's what I've been doing for 20 years. Over the past 20 years, my project, we've freed 30 innocent people from prison. We've trained hundreds of students to become better lawyers by working on real cases. And I teach them like it's like medical school, where a doctor will teach med students while they're working with real patients. My students are working with real clients. And so they learn how to do interviewing. They learn how to do crime scene analysis. They learn all the skills you need to be a good criminal lawyer. So I've trained 240 students now through the clinic. And we work on changing laws. We actually write laws in our office and work with legislatures. And we've had several laws passed involving access to DNA evidence, ability to reopen cases, compensation for innocent people who come out of prison. So it's a clinic. It's an actual law firm that's a teaching clinic. And we've seen in the past 20 years, I've worked around the world with other people starting projects, and we now have more than 100 of these types of innocence organizations all around the world. I work a lot in Latin America. I oversee 20 innocence organizations in Latin America. from Mexico all the way down to Chile and Argentina. And it's a universal thing because it's a universal problem. There are innocent people in prison in every country in the world, in Italy, everywhere. Every system has cracks.
That sounds really engaging, and I guess there is a lot to do. The big difference between U.S. and some other countries in the world is that the wrongful convictions may end up with a death penalty issue. And so what is now the situation about death penalty in the U.S.? We've read on Italian newspaper that in California there has been a suspension of the executions. How does it work all around the U.S. at the moment?
So the U.S. system is very hard to understand from an outside perspective because it's so unique. The U.S. is really like more than 50 countries instead of one country, because every state controls their own criminal justice system. So, for instance, in Michigan, they haven't had the death penalty in 170 years. So they're the oldest Western democracy with no death penalty, is the state of Michigan. On the other hand, we have states like Texas and states in the South that executed people last week. So in one state, you can get the death penalty for the same crime that if you walk across the street to another state, you can't get the death penalty. So we're fighting this battle state by state to get rid of the death penalty. In the 1970s, the Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional. And when the Supreme Court says that, then every state has to follow. So if they say it's a constitutional violation, then it covers the whole country. And we had a number of years of no executions. Then the states changed their procedures and included things like the trials had two phases, the guilt-innocence phase and then the sentencing phase. And they gave death penalty cases more appellate rights. So, for instance, every death case was automatically reviewed by the state Supreme Court. So they made the procedures better. And then the Supreme Court said, okay, now we're going to have you can have the death penalty again. And a bunch of states started executing people. So we're now seeing, more than half the states getting rid of the death penalty. It's state by state. It's certainly going in the direction that it's disappearing. And California, we had a huge thing, just a month ago, 2 months ago, where our governor said he's suspending the death penalty in California. California is a crazy place because we hardly ever execute anyone. It's like once every 10 years. Yet we have the largest death row probably in the world. I think India has a pretty large death row, but we've got 600 and some people waiting to be executed in California. So we don't know if it's gone for good. Right now it's suspended. There's all kinds of litigation about things like the chemicals they use when they do injections by killing someone by lethal injection. There's lawsuits about that. There was lawsuits about the electric chair because we had cases where they had to turn the electric chair on 2 or 3 times before the person died, where they were set on fire. And so the courts were ruling that the way we were doing executions was cruel. That's where it's at. Where it's at is there's a slow movement away from it, but it's a slow movement.
Okay.
And it needs to be faster. One of the things about the United States, unlike Europe, is in Europe, all the countries are so close together, they really influence each other in a cultural way. The United States is very isolated from the rest of the world. We kind of do things the United States way, and there's not a lot of influences. And there's really bad movement in the last few years that international law isn't that important in the United States. It's kind of, we do what we do. So we were one of the last countries in the world to stop executing children. And that only happened a number of years ago, where people under 18 could be executed. And we're out of step with the rest of the civilized world on the death penalty. We shouldn't be in the same grouping with countries like Iran and Iraq and China and Pakistan, but we should be more aligned with Europe Canada and Mexico and countries in our region. But we still have the death penalty, and I don't know how long it's going to exist. I think it's going to exist a very long time in the South until the Supreme Court finally says they can't do it anymore.
I understand. I have to say that also in Europe there are tendencies at the time that make us a little bit scared about perspectives. Until 10 years ago, no one would have said anything about procedures like chemical castration. That is something that now is in our political agenda in these days. And I would say that if there would be a survey today about death penalty, yes or no, in Italy, I won't bet about the percentage of people that would say yes. So tendencies are dangerous, even if we have in Europe the European Court of Human Rights that some days ago, a couple of weeks ago, ruled about the fact that even the life sentence without parole, if it has no possibility of an effective review after considerable time, is unlawful. So we keep on going back and forth in this balance. But for sure, we are at the moment, let's say, safe on this topic. A question about the adversarial system. We look at your system as the best one to avoid wrongful convictions. So adversarial cross-examinations and somehow that system where the two parties fight in front of an impartial judge. Do you think that is really the best way to avoid mistakes?
I do think it's the best way, but here's the thing. 95% of cases never go through that process. So we're at the point now where 95% of cases are resolved by plea bargain. So there isn't that sort of adversarial process where the evidence is really looked at, where there's cross-examination of the evidence. It's two lawyers, usually sitting in a room, that are making a deal. You know, and then they go back to the client, and it's like a casino. They say, do you want to pick door number 1 or door number 2? I'll give you a good example of that. There's a movie coming out about one of my cases. It's called Brian Banks. It's going to be in the movie theaters in August. And my client was 17 years old, and he had been accused by a girl at his school of rape. And his lawyer told him, look, if you take a deal, if you say you're guilty, I might be able to get you probation and you could go home. If you don't take a deal and you go to trial, you're looking at getting 44 years to life in prison. So take this deal, door number 1, you could be home. Door number 2, you die in prison. And he's 17 years old. And she told him this right before trial, before they were going to start the trial. And he's crying and he says, can I talk to my parents? They're right outside. And she says, nope, you got to make this decision right now. And so of course he takes the deal. The judge doesn't give him probation, gives him 6 years in prison. He goes to prison. He was one of the best football players, American football players in the country. He had all these scholarships and he was going to go play in the pros. Of course, 6 years later, that's all gone. He gets out of prison. And the girl gets in touch with him and says, I'm sorry I made up all that stuff in high school about you raping me. Can we still be friends? And she goes and admits that it never happened. So if it had gone to trial, that evidence would have come out because there was no DNA evidence. There was no evidence of rape. And under cross-examination, I'm confident, because I questioned her later on, that she wouldn't have been able to tell the story. But he never got that chance. So I agree that our system is one of the best in the world. But I use the example of when you have something that's homemade and there's attention paid to it versus in a factory, you always get a better product. So what's happened in the United States is our system is so big and there's so many people in it that everything's processed like a factory. And when you do things in a factory, mistakes get made. And that's why we have innocent people getting convicted. If everybody went to trial and everybody had good lawyers and all the evidence was looked at, we would still get wrongful convictions because they're impossible to get rid of, but there'd be very few. Instead, there's not that kind of review of the cases.
What might help in improve it? I don't know if you got my question. There was a bad connection.
Yeah, it froze for a second there.
No, my question was just, do you think there is something that might improve our legal systems in the sense that not everything can be done in the best way ever, but it's not possible that 90% or more of the cases has to be treated like in a factory, as you said, right?
I think the best way, what we've learned in the past 20 years, so now in the United States, we've identified 2,500 cases of wrongful conviction, and they're all documented. We have a website that has them all on, and we now know the causes, right? What are the major reasons that people get wrongfully convicted? Now, one of them is that sometimes people lie and make things up. That's a very hard one to fix. But there's other ones that aren't that hard to fix. For example, the number one cause is bad identifications. And when we look at the procedures that the police are using, we've come up with better procedures. Like we now know, for example, that when you use what we call six-pack photo arrays, where you put 6 photos in front of someone and say, can you see the person who did the crime? We now know that those don't work. We now know that if the police involved in the investigation are present during an identification procedure, they will often indicate who they think the suspect is. So we know there's a lot of ways to improve that process, and we've done that in California. We've changed how the police do identifications. We now know that people sometimes confess to things they didn't do, and that sometimes the police say they said things they didn't say. That has a very simple cure, which is videotape, video record all confessions. Like don't allow the police to say what was said. And then if the jury sees 12, 13, 14 hours of interrogation, they can see what the person said and in what context. Because I've had cases where after 13, 14 hours, the person just says, okay, I didn't do it, but I can't take this anymore. Give me the paper, I'll sign it. Okay, I did it. Well, if the jury knew that they were saying that, they'd have a different perspective on it. We also know now that many people go to prison due to false testimony by other prisoners. So prisoners will make deals. They'll say, oh, my cellmate told me he did it. And they'll say, okay, well, if you come and testify to that, we'll give you a deal on your case. So what we call snitch testimony. That's a major cause of wrongful convictions. So if you did those 3 things, improved your ID procedures, videotaped confessions, didn't let informant testimony in, those things happen in every country in the world. Those aren't American problems. Those are universal. So there's things in the investigation phase that lead to the wrongful convictions more than anything else. And then, of course, you have things like bad lawyers that don't have good enough training, don't do a good enough job, poorly trained police and other aspects. You'll never get rid of them all because you have really tough things like corrupt judges, corrupt prosecutors, people who just lie. But we're doing a bad job at dealing with the simple ones that we could deal with. And we've been fighting about it for 20 years in the United States. I spend a lot of time in Latin America talking about it, and they've got, Mexico has the most corrupt police force in the world, and their problems are tremendous. But Mexico just started doing trials this year. For 400 years, everything's been done on paper, so you never get to question witnesses. And that's why there's so many innocent people in prison there, because their procedures are terrible. But the challenge right now is training the lawyers how to use the new procedures. So for the past 4 or 5 years, I've spent about a third of my time in Latin America teaching lawyers how to do trials.
I guess that all over the world, the level of the defense attorney is very important to avoid these kind of situations, right?
It's just like doing this interview. You know, if you're not good at an interview, you don't get the right information. And if a lawyer's not good at questioning, they don't get the right information. And it's a universal problem.
Yeah, even if the plea bargaining at that percentage can be really something hard to avoid, since the system can work only if that high percentage of cases don't go to trial, right?
Exactly. If the deals are made in the dark, mistakes will be made. There's things we won't know. And that's a tough problem to deal with in the United States because we've let the system get so big due to over-criminalization. For example, I was just watching the Democratic debates from the United States last night. And one of the big debates is whether we make immigration violations a crime or is it a civil action? So are we going to say we're going to put them in prison or are we going to say you go back to Mexico? That's a huge question because we fill our prisons now with immigrants. And now as the system gets filled, all the resources are gone, and now you have no resources left to put people in trial, and then everybody just gets dealt out. And it's a problem. It keeps getting a bigger and bigger problem. And then there's the political side of it, that the politicians love it because they get money from the prison industry to build the prisons. They get support from the police officers' unions. They get support from the prison workers' unions. And the public loves for them to say they're tough on crime because the politics of fear is very effective. And you see that, I'm in Britain right now. You see that in Britain with Brexit. You see that with immigration around the world. It's a whole politics of fear. And like you say in Italy, you have people talking about the death penalty. And all they would have to do is do a Google search in the United States to see all the statistics of what a failure it's been. But still, there's probably politicians in Italy who use the politics of fear to say we need to kill these people. They're scary. They're coming after your family. And this evil cycle happens.
Politics is somehow very similar all over the world, I would say, unfortunately. Anyway.
Yeah, it is.
We thank you very much for conversation for this interview. And thank you very much for this conversation, this interview. Sorry for the bad connection issues. And I hope we will keep in touch and you will keep us updated about the activity of the Innocence Project in the world.
Absolutely.
Okay? Thank you very much.
Send me a link when you get it together.
Thank you very much, Justin.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.